else in a name. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 2. I knew my English major would come in handy one day. This is when Romeo and Juliet, having just fallen in love, try to figure out how they can be together, in spite of the long-standing feud between their families, Juliet's Capulets and Romeo's Montagues. Juliet, in this little section, states that names don't mean anything. A thing is what it is because it is what it is, not because of what it's called. In other words, she and Romeo are meant to be together because they're in love, and they shouldn't be apart just because of what their names happen to be. Well, I'm not here to disagree that Romeo and Juliet shouldn't be together, although, spoiler alert, they don't end up together. But the question is she right about names? Are they meaningless? I think it's really hard to agree with Juliet. We all know that words have power, and names have the most power of all. Ask any kid who's ever been teased if names have meaning. They'll tell you they do. It's why political and religious movements are always very careful in how they select their names. And for many of us, our own names mean a great deal to us. Perhaps they're a reminder of a family member. Maybe you're named after a favorite character from literature or from the Bible. Maybe you hate your name. No matter what, though, you have a reaction to it, and it has some sort of meaning to you. In the Bible, the process of naming is extremely important. A huge percentage of the Old Testament is given over to what places should be called and how children should be named. Literally, the first action taken by a human being in the entire Bible is when Adam takes on the task of naming the animals. Even in the New Testament, the naming of Jesus is a very significant event, and it gets quite a bit of space considering how little space is devoted to Jesus' pre-infancy. Names, biblically speaking, mean a lot. And in this passage from John today, we see Jesus get 2 disciples, and one of them gets a new name. Now, it's kind of odd how these 2 new disciples come to Jesus. They actually start out the passage as disciples of John the Baptist. And as they're hanging out with John, John tells them that he is, in fact, a forerunner to the Lamb of God. And at one point, he just says, "Look, here's the Lamb of God." And you just kind of imagine him pointing right at Jesus. So Andrew, one of these disciples of John the Baptist, grabs his brother Simon, and they go over to Jesus. Weirdly, Andrew is the one who's credited with the initiative here, but he's going to basically be forgotten in the rest of the literature of the New Testament. He doesn't do nearly as much the rest of the way as his brother. And even here, we don't get that much information about Andrew. What we actually see Andrew do is introduce Jesus and his brother to one another. And what's the first thing Jesus does in this interaction with Simon? He looks at Simon, he identifies him, he says, "You are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Peter." Well, the text actually says Cephas, but that means Peter, so we'll just go with Peter. Anyway, Jesus takes one look at this Simon and says, "Sure, your name is Simon, but no, that's not who you really are. Who you really are is Peter." As I'm sure many of you remember from a host of sermons you've heard over the years, Peter means rock, and later Jesus tells Peter that he is the rock on which Jesus will build his church. So there's a bit of a pun to the name. But personally, I think it's amazing that Jesus sees Peter and is able to rename him as who he is meant to be without a second glance. Because ultimately what Jesus is doing here is not a simple renaming. He's not simply saying, "You know, you really don't look like a Simon. I think I'm going to call you Peter instead." Rather, he sees someone who comes seeking him. And Jesus says, "Yes, follow me will show you who you are truly meant to be. And as Christians, it's important for us to figure out who we are really meant to be in God's eyes. So one of the amazing things, I think, that's taught in this short interaction between Jesus and Peter is that God knows who we are intimately. But another point brought up subtly by this text is that God is constantly showing us whose we are, as well as who we are. We do not belong to ourselves or to our families. And inasmuch as we belong to one another, that is not in the end to whom we truly belong. As Jesus reminds us in this passage, we are each beloved of God. If that weren't the case, Jesus wouldn't be capable of calling on a lowly person like Peter. So not only does God help us find out who we are and whose we are, this is so important, this whose we are component, because it's really easy, I think, in this day and age, to live for ourselves. I would bet that you see in your day anywhere from a minimum of 50 to a maximum of 5,000 messages a day, depending on how much media you consume, telling you to live for yourself and yourself alone. It's called advertising, and all it ever tells you is that your desires and goals and dreams are the most important thing in the entire world. And in fact, it then tries to impose its own agenda on your desires. Constantly, advertising sends us the message that to be a whole and valuable person, all you need to be is happy, and in order to be happy, all you need is insert product here. In reality, being whole and being valuable is something that is given to us by God. God has said we are whole and valuable. And ultimately, it's not the advertising companies, nor even ourselves to whom we belong, but rather to God. So if we're good enough for God, we should be good enough for everyone else too. As I already said, this passage from John highlights both who we are and whose we are, but it reminds us of one more thing. God shows us how we are to live. We are here for a reason. We exist for a purpose. God desires your discipleship, your action in the world. That's the other thing about Jesus' naming of Peter. As I mentioned, Petros in Greek is rock, and Peter is the rock on which Jesus builds his church. I don't think this is just a simple naming of one individual in history, but rather it goes to show that it's not just a matter of knowing who we are or whose we are. Because while those things are good, they're not the whole picture. The whole picture is that God is actively seeking you out as a disciple, as someone who is going to bring about the promised change in the world that God desires for us. I know I just talked about this last week, but since this week's passage deals yet again with Jesus' baptism, I can't help but repeat a few themes. The most important calling we ever receive as Christians is the call we receive through baptism. The call to be part of God's beloved community. This is the call that asks us to work for justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. It's the call that asks us to love Jesus to love the Lord with all our heart and our whole being, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. These are not easy tasks, but they're present with us all the time. The truth about baptism is that while baptism is the place we recognize this call as a church, the call itself to live as God's people, who seek to live in a way that is pleasing to God, that call is present from before we were even a glimmer in a mother's eye. God calls us to these things by virtue of our very existence. And so while this passage today seemingly contains this innocuous little story about Jesus gaining 2 disciples, it really is, I think, much more than that for us today. It helps to remind us who we are and whose we are and what we're for. And that is a reminder that it never hurts to receive. Amen. We can join together in hymn number 358, Love Divine, All